Sydney is not an old city by world standards, but one of its oldest streets is Oxford Street. It's had a colourful history. Along the way, it's been the scene of slums, drugs and prostitution. Historian and writer Gary Wotherspoon gives us a warts and all tour.
Behind me you can see Sydney's CBD, but here where I'm standing is the start of Oxford Street, which leads out to the South Head. It started out as an Indigenous track, but it then became a strategic road for the early settlement. Over time it's changed, but it's still one of Sydney's more interesting streets. Behind me is Victoria Barracks. It's very strategically located. It's on a hill. It looked back out to Botany Bay, it looked out to the Heads, and it looked back to Sydney town. It was one of the major public works projects of the 1840s, which brought a lot of life to the street. The courthouse, it was built in the 1840s, and it was one of the few buildings that were actually on Oxford Street before the gold rushes came. So there was only this one and the big jail behind. In the jail, they used to have public hangings up until the 1840s. Probably the most famous case was John Natchbull. They had 10,000 people come to look at his hanging. And public hangings were seen as part of the way of enforcing the law at that time. By the end of the 19th century, parts of Sydney had really become slums, particularly in the inner city. And then with the plague of 1900, they decided that slum clearance was very important. And Oxford Street was one of those streets which had a large part of its north side knocked down so that the street could actually be widened. And so right up until the end of the 19th century, this was a major destination shopping area. Oxford Street had done so well that by 1875 they actually wanted to change the name from the South Head Road to Oxford Street, mimicking Oxford Street, which is a major shopping street in London. Taylor Square is the hub of Oxford Street. It's got the courthouse behind it, it's got the streets leading off to the various beach suburbs, and it's also been the site of a lot of the major parades that have come up Oxford Street. This is where the gay parade turns and goes out to the showground. Darlinghurst Police Station, or it used to be, is behind me here. It's now a community centre. But in the 1920s, it was a major centre of the cocaine trade and gang warfare in Sydney. The police in Sydney, right from the very early days of the convict era, have had a very bad reputation for corruption. And Darlinghurst Police Station in the 1920s had a reputation known as Goldenhurst. No policeman ever left here poor. After World War II, the old areas around Oxford Street, the slums, many people just left those and new people came in. Among the people coming in to live in the Oxford Street area from the 1960s onwards were a lot of students, cheap accommodation in the area around Paddington, Surrey Hills and East Sydney. Behind me here we've got G.A. Zinks, a tailor, which has been here since the early 20th century. And as you can see from the sort of facade, it's really a very smart deco building. Just beyond it is what was a bank, but it's now an Indian restaurant. And this, both of these things reflect the very different communities that have actually lived here on Oxford Street. We often tend today to think that multiculturalism came to Australia after World War II. But from the gold rushes of the 1850s, this area here was just packed with different people from different communities. People used to have their business in the front and their residence behind the shop upstairs. We had Greeks, we had Turks, we had Chinese, we had everything here. Even though Darlinghurst in the 1920s was the centre of the sex trade really continued on much later. Probably the most interesting story occurred in World War II, when Oxford Street actually became the dividing line between where American soldiers could have sex. Black American soldiers were confined to the south of Oxford Street in Surrey Hills, where white American soldiers, or any white soldiers, were allowed to have sex on the north side. And two madams ran this, and they were great rivals. Kate Leigh on the south and Tilly Devine, the famous Tilly Devine, ran all the brothels on the north. So over 2 centuries of white history, Oxford Street has really changed in many ways. It was initially a magnet for the elites, the working class, migrants, students, deros, wineys, homeless people, gays, artists, barmaids, everything like that. It's one of the Sydney streets that's had a very interesting and diverse history.